Chapter 1. The Hook. The tank hummed at a frequency just below hearing, a vibration I felt more than heard, somewhere behind my sternum. I'd stopped noticing it around month 3. That was the thing nobody told you about working at Site Meridian. The horror didn't stay horrifying. It became furniture. A sound the walls made. A shape behind glass that ate at the same hour every night and watched you back with the patient attention of something that had all the time in the world and had decided, for now, to spend it on you. I logged the 11 p.m. readings the way I logged everything. Hand steady, voice flat, eyes on the monitor instead of the tank. Subject heart rate, 38 BPM. Vocal cavity inactive. No aggressive posturing. Behind me, on the other side of 8 inches of reinforced acrylic, Kai floated with his arms loose at his sides, dark hair drifting like something underwater always does, like it hasn't gotten the message, yet that stillness is possible. I didn't turn around. I never turned around first. That was rule 1, the one Voss had drilled into me on my first day. You observe. You do not engage. Whatever you feel watching him, remember he is not watching you back. He is a stimulus response system with very good aim. I believed that mostly for the first 2 months. I stopped fully believing it the night I caught him watching my hands instead of my face, the tremor I got near the end of a double shift, the one I'd spent years training out of every other part of my life except this one, apparently, because he found it anyway. "You're doing the thing again," Priya said through my earpiece, her voice flat with the particular boredom of someone who has spent 4 years staring at a facility's worth of aging server racks. Staring instead of typing. "I'm typing." "You typed 1 line in 90 seconds. I can see your keystroke log, Wren. It's part of my job to see your keystroke log, which is deeply unfortunate for both of us." I typed the 2nd line. No change from baseline behavior. That was a lie, technically. There was always change. Nothing about 6 months of nightly proximity to something with eyes like poured ink stayed static, no matter how the reports read. But change wasn't the metric anyone wanted from me. Compliance was. Stability was. A clean, boring, defensible record that justified why the agency kept feeding an unclassified asset instead of quietly disposing of it. The way they disposed of 2 before him that I knew about, and God knew how many I didn't. I finished the log. I didn't look up. I told myself that was discipline and not cowardice, the same way I told myself a lot of things at 11 p.m. with the platform creaking around me and 40 feet of black water on the other side of the hull. My brother used to tell me the ocean doesn't hate you. It doesn't do anything to you on purpose. It's just very large and very old and utterly indifferent to whether you know how to swim. He said that to me 2 weeks before it didn't matter whether he knew how to swim either. I don't know why I thought about Finn that particular night. Maybe it was the hum. Maybe it was some animal part of my brain that had clocked, before the rest of me had, that something in the room had changed pitch. The first alarm didn't sound like an alarm. That was the strange part, the part I'd turn over for weeks afterward. It sounded like silence, a specific, wrong kind, the tank's ambient hum dropping out mid-breath the way a held note drops when a singer runs out of air. I'd spent 6 months learning that hum the way you learn a person's breathing beside you in bed. When it stopped, my whole body knew, before my mind caught up. I turned around. The monitor bank behind me, heart rate, vocal frequency, neuroresponse, the entire architecture of my careful clinical distance, had gone dark. Not flickering, not glitching. Dark, all 6 screens at once. The kind of failure that isn't an accident, the kind that requires either a catastrophic systems collapse or a hand that knew exactly which lines to cut. "Priya." My voice came out wrong, too quiet for the size of what was happening. "Priya, I've lost every reading." Silence on the earpiece. Not her usual dry silence. A silence with static under it, like the channel itself had frozen. I looked at the tank. It was empty, not shattered. Not flooded past its containment, no alarm, no breach klaxon, nothing that would have made sense of the wrongness crawling up the back of my neck. Just still water, undisturbed, moonlight colored under the emergency lighting, and no shape moving through it. 6 months of watching had taught my eyes exactly where he should be, and there was nothing there to see. I heard the door behind me, the reinforced one, The one that required a keycard and a code and Vasa's personal authorization to open from the containment side. Unlatched with a sound too soft to be anything but deliberate. I turned around slowly. The way you turn when some part of you already knows and the rest of you is only stalling. Kai was standing in the doorway to the observation room, on my side of the glass, dripping onto the tile between us, close enough that I could see the water running down the ridges of his throat where the gills used to be, close enough to see that his eyes, that unnerving double-lidded dark, weren't on the monitors, weren't on the door, weren't on anything in the room except me. "Hello, Wren," he said, in a voice I had never once heard through 8 inches of soundproofed acrylic, low and human and terribly gentle. I've been wanting to do that properly for a while now. Chapter 2, Collision. For 6 months, I had built an entire discipline out of not reacting. It was the only skill the job actually required. Not intelligence, not steady hands, just the ability to look at something that could unmake you and write down a number instead of scream. That discipline lasted exactly as long as it took him to say my name. "How do you know that?" I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing much further away. "How do you know my name?" "You say it to yourself? Sometimes. Late shifts, when you think the room's empty." He tilted his head, and water dripped from the point of his jaw onto the tile, an oddly domestic sound. "You also say a name that isn't yours. Finn. You said it 3 times last month, always around midnight." The floor didn't move, but I felt it anyway, some structural give beneath my sternum. I hadn't said Finn's name out loud in years. Not to Naomi, not to my mother, not to the 2 therapists the agency required me to see before clearing me for fieldwork. I had certainly never said it in a room I believed was monitored, recorded, and utterly one-directional. "You shouldn't be able to hear anything out here," I said, because it was easier than the alternative sentence, the one about grief. "The glass is rated for my voice." Yes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "It was never rated to keep me from listening to yours." Nobody thought that mattered. I don't think anyone considered that I might simply want to hear you, rather than harm you. It didn't fit the file. I should have hit the alarm. There was a panel 8 feet to my left, a single red switch that would flood the platform with security inside 90 seconds, old people, tranquilizer rounds, the whole apparatus built to handle exactly this scenario. I had run the drill 11 times in training. I knew the distance to the switch better than I knew the distance between my own front teeth. I didn't move toward it. Later, much later, in the version of the story I told myself trying to sleep, I would tell myself that I hesitated because I was calculating threat level, gathering data, being the scientist Voss had hired. That was a lie I liked because it let me keep something of myself intact. The truth was smaller and worse. I didn't move because some part of me, the part that had spent 6 months alone on a platform in the middle of the ocean with nothing to talk to but a locked door and a heartbeat monitor, did not want him to leave. "You broke the sensors," I said instead, which was at least a true sentence, if not the bravest one available to me. "I didn't break anything." He said it without pride, like a man correcting a minor point of etiquette. I found the wire that mattered and I asked it, very politely, to stop working for a few minutes. Machines are simpler than people, Wren. They don't need a reason. People need a reason before they'll let themselves stop performing. "Is that what I'm doing?" "Performing. Every night." He crouched, unhurried, until we were closer to level, and I registered distantly that a creature blamed for getting 3 trawlers in a single season was folding himself smaller in front of me instead of larger, the exact opposite of every threat display I'd been trained to watch for. You write things down that aren't true. Not lies exactly, just smaller than what actually happened. I wondered for a long time if you knew you were doing it. "I write down what the readings show." "You write down what's safe to have shown." His head tilted the other way, water sliding along his collarbone, and for one disorienting second he looked less like a myth and more like a man waiting to be believed. "I've watched you not write down the night you cried at your desk. I've watched you not write down the 2 hours you spent explaining tide patterns to me, even though I already knew them, because you needed to say something out loud to someone who wouldn't ask you what was wrong with your voice while you did it." Heat climbed up the back of my neck, an ugly, exposed feeling, being known by something I'd spent 6 months insisting was only a stimulus response system with very good aim. That's not. You don't get to use that against me. I'm not using it against you. For the first time his voice lost its patient, layered calm, and underneath it I heard something that sounded almost like hurt. I'm telling you, because I don't have anyone else to tell. I have been alone in that water for 6 months with one person who comes to look at me every night, and I have spent every one of those nights deciding not to be the thing your reports are afraid of, because I wanted. He stopped. Water dripped. Somewhere behind the wall, the platform's generators cycled with their usual indifferent hum, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that we were no longer having the conversation the tank was designed to prevent. You wanted what? I said very quietly. I wanted you to come back tomorrow and not be afraid, he said. That's all. That's the whole of it. The panel was 8 feet away. The door behind him, the one that should have required 3 separate authorizations to open from that side, hung ajar the way he'd left it. And somewhere above us, unheard, unaware, the entire architecture of Site Meridian continued to believe that I was alone in this room with a monster on the correct side of the glass. I didn't reach for the alarm. I said, you should go back before someone checks the feed, and hated myself a little for how much it sounded like an invitation to come again rather than a warning never to. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I felt it in my chest the way I used to feel the tank's hum before I stopped noticing it. And then he smiled, small and real, nothing like the files, photographs of teeth. Tomorrow then, he said, and stepped back through the water on the floor toward the tank, leaving me standing in a room full of dead monitors with no evidence at all that anything had happened, except the fact that I was already counting the hours. Chapter 3. Growing Tension. I told myself the second time would be different. I would report it. I would sit down at the terminal and type containment breach, subject exhibited advanced technical capability, recommend full systems audit, and I would mean it. And Voss would come down from the ridge in her gray suit with her gray questions, and it would all be handled the way it was supposed to be handled. I typed the first 4 words. Then I deleted them. I told myself I was waiting for more data. By the second week, the malfunctions had a rhythm. Not nightly, never predictable enough to be a pattern anyone auditing the logs could prove, but often enough that some nights I found myself watching the monitor bank with something closer to hope than dread, waiting for that specific held-breath silence that meant the hum had dropped. You've gotten better at hiding it, Priya said one afternoon. Not looking up from the server rack, she had her whole arm inside of, wrist deep in cable the color of dried blood. The gaps. They used to show up clean in the diagnostic sweep. 6, 7 minutes of total sensor blackout. Real obvious, real stupid. Now they're staggered. Some channels drop, some don't. It looks almost like normal degradation instead of somebody killing the feed on purpose. My stomach went cold and very still. What are you saying? I'm saying somebody's gotten smarter about it. She pulled her arm free, wiped grease on her coveralls, and looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite concern. Something in between, the look of a person doing arithmetic she didn't like the answer to. Or something has. I didn't answer. She didn't push. That was the thing about Priya. She collected facts the way I was supposed to, without needing to force them into a shape that made her comfortable. It made her either the most dangerous person on the platform or the only one I could trust, and I hadn't yet decided which. I'm not going to report it, she said finally, to the cable in her lap instead of to me. Not yet. But you should know Voss pulled the last 3 months of your logs personally. Not through the system. Physically pulled the drives. She looked up. That doesn't happen for stable subjects, Wren. I thought about the drives sitting in some locked drawer on the ridge, 6 months of my carefully smaller than true sentences, and wondered which version of me they'd tell her about. The one on the page, or the one who'd started leaving the observation lamp on a little longer than protocol required, so the tank wasn't dark when he surfaced. That night, Kai asked me about my brother. He didn't ask directly. He never asked anything directly. I was learning. The way a tide doesn't arrive so much as it simply, gradually, is there. He asked about the trench markers instead, the old shipping lanes, and I found myself telling him about growing up on the coast. About a boy 2 years older who taught me to read currents before he taught me to read. And somewhere in the telling, I said Finn's name out loud, on purpose this time, watching Kai's face instead of the water. He drowned, Kai said. Not a question. The boat capsized in a storm nobody predicted. I kept my voice level through long practice. I was supposed to be on it. I had a fever that week. I've spent a very long time being furious at a fever for saving my life. Kai was quiet for a while, his hands resting on the tile at the tank's lip, close enough to touch if either of us had reached. Sirens sing to ships in storms sometimes, he said. Not to lure them, to warn them off the rocks. It works sometimes. Sometimes the storm is louder than we are. He looked at me. I wasn't there. I want you to know that. Whatever storm took him, it wasn't mine. I know that. Do you? His eyes had that particular stillness they got when he was choosing words the way other people chose which knife to use. Because I've watched you flinch every time the water moves wrong for 6 months, and I don't think you've ever once let yourself believe the water isn't personally trying to finish what it started. I didn't have an answer for that. It sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading long after the splash was over. The setback, when it came from a direction I hadn't been watching. Reyes found me 3 days later in the empty commissary, nursing coffee gone cold an hour ago, and sat down across from me without being asked, which was unlike him. He'd been reassigned to logistics after his own tenure on the Siren case. The file called it reassignment for operational reasons, and nobody on the platform believed that was the whole story. You're doing the thing I did, he said, quiet, not unkind. I can see it on you. The way you stopped writing down the small stuff. I don't know what you mean. You do. He turned his cup in slow circles, not drinking. I had 8 months with a different one. Not him, before him. I thought I was the exception. I thought whatever was happening between us was real, and separate from whatever it is they do to people who get close. His eyes came up, and there was something in them I hadn't let myself imagine yet. Not warning exactly, closer to grief. They didn't reassign me because I was compromised, Wren. They reassigned me because I asked to be. Because by the time I understood what I'd let happen, I couldn't tell anymore whether the wanting was mine. The commissary hummed with the platform's ordinary machinery, indifferent to both of us. What happened to him? I asked. The one before. Reyes didn't answer that. He only looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone standing too close to an edge you already fell from, and said, watch the audit request. Voss isn't fishing anymore. She's building a file. Before he got up and left his coffee, untouched, cooling between us like a warning I didn't yet know how to read. Chapter 4. The Midpoint Twist. The audit request came through on a Tuesday, formatted the way Voss formatted everything. Clean, bloodless, impossible to argue with. Full review of subject file, containment logs, and attending researcher conduct, pending reassignment determination. My name sat under attending researcher like a verdict already written. I had 4 days before the review board convened. I spent the first one doing exactly what Reyes would have told me not to do, if he'd still been willing to talk to me. I went looking for the thing that might save Kai, instead of a thing that might save my career. Site Meridian kept its history the way it kept everything else. Compartmentalized, need to know, buried under enough clearance levels that most of the staff didn't know the facility had existed for 20 years before any of us arrived. But Priya had access to the archive drives nobody had bothered to purge because nobody had thought anyone would bother looking. And she owed me, she said, for not reporting her either. Kane's personal files, she said, sliding a drive across the table between us like it was something that might go off. Founder of this whole operation. Retired 11 years ago or vanished, depending which version of the story you believe. Nobody's touched these since. I only found them because I was looking for something else, and the metadata was wrong. I read them alone, in the observation room, with the tank's ordinary hum in the background and Kai's shape moving slow and patient on the other side of the glass, unaware, or perhaps not unaware at all, that I had finally started asking the right questions. Kane's notes weren't clinical. That was the first thing that struck me. They read like the journal of a man who'd started out believing exactly what I'd believed and had the belief taken apart from him one observation at a time. Bonding behavior in captive specimens presents identically to bonding behavior in free populations, he'd written 18 years ago, in handwriting that got smaller and more careful the further into the file I went, as if he'd known someone might read it eventually and wanted to leave no room for them to misunderstand. This is either evidence that the bond is a manipulation so total it mimics genuine attachment in every measurable way, or evidence that it is not a manipulation at all. I no longer believe the former. I have stopped being able to prove the latter to anyone who has not stood where I have stood. Further in, dated a full year later, in ink that pressed hard enough to nearly tear the page. The trawler incidents are not predation. I have cross-referenced the coordinates against the illegal harvesting routes flagged by maritime enforcement in 2003, and every wreck attributed to aggressive siren activity sits within 4 nautical miles of a poaching vessel's last known position. We are calling defense an atrocity because the truth is less useful to the people funding this facility. I sat with that for a long time before I could make myself look up. Kai was watching me. He'd been watching me, I realized, since before I started reading. He always knew, somehow, when the thing in front of me had stopped being paperwork and started being a question with his life inside it. "You found Kane's notes," he said. Not a question either. He said it the way you say something you've been waiting 11 years for someone else to say first. "The trawlers," I said. My voice came out rough. "You weren't hunting them. They were harvesting eggs from the breeding shelf 200 meters off the ridge you call Site Meridian." His voice was very level, the way mine got when I was holding something back by force. "It's been happening for years. Small operations, careful ones, easy to write off as bad weather and worse luck. I was a warden. It is not a title I chose so much as a thing. I was the way you were a brother before you were anything else. My pod trusted me to keep that water safe. I did the only thing I know how to do. 3 ships. 3 ships that would have taken more from that water than the ocean could replace in a generation." Something in his face cracked, just slightly, the calm giving way to something raw underneath. "I have let your people call me a monster for 6 months because the alternative was explaining what they were protecting by calling me one. Nobody wanted to hear that the wreckage was a mercy. It didn't fit the file. I thought of Voss's audit sitting 4 days away. I thought of Reyes, cooling coffee untouched between us, telling me he'd asked to be reassigned because he could no longer trust his own wanting. If I put this in my report," I said slowly, "if I show them Kane's notes, the poaching coordinates, they will bury it faster than they buried Kane." Kai's hand came to rest against the glass. Not a gesture I'd seen from him before, no purpose to it except the plane wanting to be closer than the barrier allowed. "Wren, whatever you do with this, you will not be believed by writing the truth down. You will only be believed if you're willing to be as compromised as Kane was, as Reyes was." His eyes held mine, dark and steady and terribly honest. "As you already are, whether or not you've said it yet." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He could see it on my face the same way he'd been reading me for 6 months, the exact moment the clipboard I'd been hiding behind finally, completely, stopped being enough. Behind me, the door to the observation room opened without a knock, and Voss's voice said, "Dr. Kase, we need to talk about your logs," and I realized, turning, that she was holding a folder with my name on it, and that whatever choice I still thought I had was about to be made for me. Chapter 5. Everything falls apart. Voss set the folder on the desk between us without sitting down, which was somehow worse than if she'd sat. Standing meant she wasn't planning to stay long enough for a conversation. Standing meant she'd already decided how this ended. 6 months of logs, she said, and exactly 41 discrepancies between your written reports and the raw sensor data Priya's team recovered this morning from a supposedly dead channel. She opened the folder and didn't look at it, because she didn't need to. She'd clearly memorized it before she walked in. Heart rate readings you rounded down. Vocalization, events you didn't log at all. And 6 unexplained sensor blackouts in the last 3 weeks, every one of them coinciding with a period during which the containment door shows an open state on the mechanical log, but no corresponding entry in your notes. I said nothing, because there was nothing true I could say that wouldn't finish the sentence for her. "I want to be clear about what I think happened here," Voss said. "I don't think you're compromised in the way Reyes was compromised. I think you're smarter than he was, which is worse, because it means you knew exactly what you were hiding and chose to hide it anyway. She closed the folder. Effective immediately. You're suspended from the case pending review. Sergeant Ole will escort you from the containment wing. Subject is being reclassified for transfer. The word landed wrong, a half beat behind its meaning, the way bad news always did. Transfer where? That's above your clearance now. Something in her face flickered, not quite sympathy, closer to the practiced regret of someone who had delivered this sentence before and would deliver it again. There's an outside contractor with interest in behavioral applications of vocal weaponry. I imagine you can extrapolate what that means without me spelling it out. The room tilted, very slightly, the way it had the first night the hum went silent. You can't do that. He's not a weapon. He's an asset that has apparently developed enough behavioral sophistication to compromise a researcher's judgment inside of 6 months, Voss said, and for the first time her voice had an edge in it, something almost like fear dressed up as procedure. That's not an argument for keeping him here, Dr. Kase. That's the entire argument for the transfer. She left. Ole was waiting in the corridor, and to his credit he didn't say anything on the walk to the outer wing, just kept a pace behind me with his hand not quite on my arm, the careful escort of a man who'd been given orders he didn't love executing. I didn't see Kai again for 2 days. They moved me to the surface-level dormitories out of the containment wing entirely, and every hour of those 2 days I sat with Kane's file open on a tablet I probably wasn't supposed to still have access to, trying to build an argument out of 11-year-old handwriting, and poaching coordinates that nobody with the power to stop the transfer had any incentive to read. On the third night, Teo found me in the commissary, looking like a man who'd been sent to deliver something he didn't want to carry. "The broker's here," he said, low, sliding into the seat across from me. "Came in on the afternoon transport. Meeting with Voss right now. Priya says the paperwork's already routed. Transfer window opens at 0600, day after tomorrow. 2 days. I had 2 days. I need to see him, I said. Teo's face did something complicated. Wren, you're suspended. If you go anywhere near that wing. I know what happens. I did know. I'd read Reyes's face closely enough these past weeks to understand exactly what happened to people who got caught mattering too much to an asset. I need to see him anyway. I want to say I had a plan. I didn't not that night, only the animal certainty that if I let them move Kai onto a transport without saying anything true to him, I would spend the rest of my life being the kind of coward who wrote smaller-than-true sentences about the one thing that had ever asked to be known by me honestly. Ole was on the containment wing that night, and when I came around the corner past the point I had any authorization to be, he didn't reach for his radio. He looked at me for a long moment, long enough that I understood later it had cost him something, and then he stepped aside from the door and said, 10 minutes. I never saw you. Kai was already at the glass when I came in, like he'd known, the way he always knew. They're moving you, I said, because there wasn't time for anything gentler. I know. His voice was very quiet, stripped of its usual patient calm. I've known since this morning. I could hear it in the corridor. New voices, new equipment. A transport crate doesn't sound like anything else. I'm going to stop it. I didn't know yet how. I said it anyway, because it was the only true thing I had left to offer him. Something moved across his face. Grief and hope tangled together so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. Wren. He pressed his palm flat to the glass, the same gesture from days ago, except this time I crossed the distance and put my hand against his from the other side, without letting myself think first about all the reasons I shouldn't. If you do this, he said, voice cracking on the words, there's no report you can write afterward that makes you safe again. You understand that. Whatever happens to me happens to you now too. I know, I said, and meant it more than I'd meant anything in 6 months of careful, smaller-than-true sentences. And behind me, unheard until it was too late, I caught the sound of the corridor door opening, and Voss's voice, cold and final, saying, Sergeant Ole, explain to me why Dr. Kase is standing in a wing he was removed from 3 days ago. Chapter 6, Fighting Back. There's a version of this story where I apologize, where I step back from the glass, hands raised, and let Ole take the fall for a kindness he didn't have to offer me, and let Voss write the ending she'd already decided on 3 days ago. I understand intellectually that this would have been the safer choice. I have never once, since that night, regretted not making it. It was my decision, I said, before Ole could open his mouth. He didn't let me in. I came in on my own authorization, override from before my suspension processed. If there's a violation here, it's mine. It wasn't true. Ole had stepped aside on purpose, had looked at me like a man handing over something he knew he'd pay for. But Voss didn't know that, and I would rather burn my own name than his for a kindness that cost him a career he'd built for 15 years. Voss looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face was almost, briefly, tired rather than angry. You have no idea what you've attached yourself to, she said. I've read Kane's files too, Dr. Kase. I read them a decade ago, before I had this job. I know exactly what he believed by the end of it, and I know exactly what happened to his career, his family, and eventually to him. Her voice didn't soften, but it slowed, like she was choosing to say something true instead of something procedural. I'm not doing this because I think he's a monster. I'm doing this because I have watched 2 researchers before you lose everything to precisely this feeling, and I would rather remove you from the situation while you still have something left to walk away with. Then read the coordinates, I said. The poaching routes. The trawlers weren't random victims. They were harvesting the breeding shelf. And every wreck sits inside the range of an illegal Operation Maritime Enforcement flagged years before this facility existed. Kane proved it. It's in his files, Director. You've read them. You know I'm not making this up. For the first time since I'd known her, Voss looked uncertain. And it lasted exactly as long as it took the broker to appear in the corridor behind her, unhurried, unbothered, the particular calm of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Director Voss, he said. I heard raised voices. Is there a problem with the transfer? No problem, Voss said, too quickly. And I understood then that whatever authority she had, it didn't extend far enough to override whoever this man answered to. Dr. Kase was just leaving the wing. The broker's eyes moved to me, unhurried, cataloging. Dr. Kase, I've read your file. 6 months of exemplary containment work, right up until the last 3 weeks. He smiled, the kind of smile that had never needed to mean anything. I understand attachment happens. It's a known risk profile in this work. It doesn't change the transfer window. He left. Voss didn't look at me again before she followed him, and I understood, watching her go, that whatever chance I'd had of convincing her through the proper channels had closed the moment his shadow crossed the corridor. I found Priya an hour later in the server room, and I didn't bother easing into it. I need the transport manifest, I said. The route, the timing, whatever access you can get me. She looked at me for a long moment, wrench in hand, and I watched her do the same arithmetic Reyes had done weeks ago, weighing what this would cost her against what it might mean to be the kind of person who let it happen anyway. You understand what you're asking me, she said. This isn't malfunctioning wires anymore. This is federal. I know, and you're doing it anyway. I am. She set the wrench down, slow, deliberate, the sound of a decision. Kane's notes are federal too. Technically. Should have been reported the day I found them. She pulled up a terminal, fingers already moving. Transport leaves 0600, day after tomorrow, from the lower dock. Standard containment crate, water cycled. Life support rated for 48 hours max transit. Her jaw tightened. 48 hours to wherever they're taking him, Wren. That's not a local facility. That's cross-border. Teo found us there 20 minutes later, out of breath, having apparently run the length of the platform. Ole wants to talk to you, he said. Both of you. He says it has to be now, and he says to bring whatever you've got on the poaching coordinates. We found Ole in the equipment bay, arms crossed, looking like a man who'd spent the last hour arguing with himself and lost. I've been doing this job 12 years, he said, without preamble. I've moved 4 assets out of this facility in that time. 3 of them didn't survive transit, officially due to complications. His jaw worked. I stopped believing in complications a long time ago. Are you saying you'll help? I said. I'm saying I've got a narrow window and a security override that still works until midnight tomorrow, when they're planning to revoke my access along with everyone else's who's been within 10 feet of you this week. He looked at me, hard, weighing. I'm saying if we're doing this, we do it once, we do it clean, and none of us gets a second chance to explain ourselves after. Behind him, on the wall monitor nobody had thought to disable, the containment feed flickered back to life for just a moment. Kai, alone in the tank, still and watching the door the way he'd been watching it for 6 months. As if he already knew, somehow, that the only people left willing to save him were standing in a room, deciding exactly how much of themselves they were prepared to lose to do it. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. We had one night to plan and no room left for mistakes, so we didn't try to build something elaborate. Ol's override was real but temporary. Priya's access to the transport manifest was real, but traceable the moment anyone thought to look. And the only genuinely reliable thing in the entire operation was the plain fact that nobody expected for people who'd spent years being careful to do something reckless all at once. The crate gets loaded at 05:30, Ol said, spreading a printout across the equipment bay table like a man defusing something. Water-cycled, sealed, moved by rail cart to the lower dock. 2 escorts, standard procedure, because nobody's briefed on this as a security risk. It's a transfer, not an extraction. That's our only advantage. They're not expecting a fight. I can kill the rail cart's guidance for 90 seconds, Priya said. Not longer. Long enough for a manual reroute, if somebody's physically there to do it. That's me, Ol said. Then Teo and I get Wren to the lower dock before the escort finishes the loading protocol. Priya went on. And Wren does whatever it is Wren's going to do, because none of the rest of us can talk to him the way Wren can. I understood, hearing it laid out like that, exactly how much they were trusting me with, not just their careers, which they'd already offered up freely enough, but the entire operation's single point of failure, standing at the center of the plan for no better reason than that a creature the file called a monster would apparently only listen to me. The corridor to the containment wing at 4 in the morning felt like something out of a dream I'd had before and forgotten the ending of. Emergency lighting, instead of the usual fluorescence. The platform's ordinary hum sounding, for the first time in 6 months, like something worth being afraid of instead of something I'd stopped noticing. Kai was already awake when I reached the tank. Of course he was, he always knew. And when he saw my face through the glass, whatever hope had been holding him together for the last 2 days, visibly, quietly, broke open. You shouldn't be here, he said, but he was already moving toward the water's edge, already reaching for the glass the way he did every time, like his body hadn't caught up yet to whatever his mind was warning him. I'm getting you out, I said. Not the way they think. Not the way Kane tried. We have maybe 90 seconds at the rail cart, and after that we're improvising. Wren. His hand pressed flat against the glass, and mine came up automatically to meet it, an old habit built in 2 weeks that felt like it had been there my whole life. If this fails, they won't just transfer me. They'll bury what happened here. Kane's notes, the poaching evidence, all of it. And you. I know what happens to me. I did know. I'd known since Reyes sat down across from me with his cooling coffee and told me the wanting stops feeling like it's yours. I'd rather be the kind of person who tried and lost than the kind who wrote a smaller-than-true sentence about it for the rest of my life. I've already been that person for 6 months, Kai. I'm done. The containment doors lock-cycled, Ol's override, right on schedule. And for the first time since I'd met him, Kai stepped fully out of the water and onto the tile on his own, unassisted. His skin already beginning the slow shift toward the paler human tones it took on outside the tank, water running off him in sheets. 48 hours of life support in that crate, he said, steadying himself against the door frame, voice tight with the effort of a body not built for open air. I won't need 48 hours if this works. I only need to reach open water. We made the rail cart with 11 seconds to spare by Priya's count, relayed through Ol's earpiece in clipped, furious whispers. The 2 escorts on shift were exactly as unprepared as we'd hoped, trained to walk a crate to a dock, not trained to face down a director's, suspended researcher, and a facility founder's inconvenient decade-old files, which I had, in the end, printed and carried in a folder under my arm like the world's least dramatic weapon. Read it, I said, shoving the folder at the senior escort while Ol worked the cart's manual override behind me. Poaching coordinates. Maritime Enforcement's own flag routes from 2003, cross-referenced against every wreck this facility has ever blamed on him. You're not escorting a weapon to a research contract. You're escorting evidence of what actually happened out of the one place anyone might have read it. I don't know if it was the file that stopped them, or Ole's rank, or simply 4 people appearing at 0540 with enough conviction to make hesitation look like the safer option. But they stopped, and in the gap that hesitation bought us, Kai came off the cart under his own power and made it, step by unsteady step, to the dock's edge, where 40 feet of black water waited exactly the way it always had. Indifferent, enormous, and for the first time in 6 months, not something either of us had reason to be afraid of. He turned back once. Water was already lapping at his ankles, and behind him, alarms had finally started somewhere up in the ridge. Voss's voice audible over a distant intercom demanding to know what in God's name was happening at the lower dock. "Come with me," Kai said, and it wasn't a demand. It was the most frightened I had ever heard him. "Or come find me. I don't care which, Wren, only tell me it's one of the two." I looked back once at Ole, at Priya, at Teo standing in the wreckage of every career any of us had built at Site Meridian, and understood that whichever answer I gave next, none of us were walking back into that facility as the people we'd been an hour ago. Chapter 8, Resolution. I didn't go into the water that night. I want to say that clearly, because for a long time afterward I wasn't sure how to explain the choice to anyone, including myself. "Find me," I said, standing at the edge of the dock with the alarms climbing behind me and everything I'd built at Site Meridian already in ruins. Not because I don't want to. Because if I go now, it's a man running from a burning building. I want it to be something else. I want to come to you because I chose it with a clear head, not because there was nothing left to stay for. Kai looked at me for a long moment, water at his knees, and something in his face. Fear, hope, the particular ache of a man who'd spent 6 months learning to trust exactly one person, settled into something quieter. "Then I'll wait," he said. "I'm good at waiting. You taught me that mostly without meaning to." He smiled, small and real, the way he had the very first night. "The breeding shelf off the ridge. Kane's coordinates. That's where I'll be, once I'm strong enough to travel. Come when you're ready, Wren. Not before." Then he was gone, a shape sliding under black water, and the dock was empty, and Voss's people arrived 4 minutes too late to do anything but stand at the edge of the water with their weapons lowered, looking at 4 people who had clearly, deliberately, let an asset go. The consequences were real, and I won't pretend otherwise. Ole lost his position, though not his freedom. Kane's file, once it surfaced through channels none of us controlled anymore, made outright prosecution politically messy for an agency that badly wanted this story to disappear quietly instead of loudly. Priya was reassigned to a facility 3 time zones away, a demotion dressed up as a lateral transfer, though she told me before she left that she'd take it 100 times over. Teo somehow kept his job, young enough and junior enough to be written off as having simply followed orders he didn't understand, and I let him carry that story because it cost him nothing, and it was, in its way, half true. I was let go outright, quietly, without charges, the agency apparently deciding that a scandal about a compromised researcher was less damaging than a scandal about a compromised researcher plus a trial. Voss delivered the news herself, in the same flat, exhausted voice she'd used every other time. Except at the end of it, she said something I hadn't expected. "Kane wrote something else, near the end of his files," she said. "Something I didn't include when I gave you access. He wrote that the mistake wasn't loving what he was studying. The mistake was thinking it disqualified him from also being right." She closed the folder between us for the last time. "I don't know if you were right, Dr. Kase. I know you weren't wrong in every way I assumed you were. That's going to have to be enough of an ending for both of us." It took me 4 months to go back to the water. I told myself it was caution, recovering a career, however small, that I could still salvage, making sure nobody was watching the ridge closely enough to follow me there. Some of that was true. Most of it, if I'm honest, was fear of a different kind than the one I'd spent 6 months practicing. Not fear of the water or of him, but fear that 4 months was long enough for a promise made at the edge of a dock in the middle of an alarm to have become something neither of us could actually keep. I needn't have worried. He was waiting exactly where he said he'd be, in water so clear I could see him before I'd even reached the shelf's edge. And when he surfaced, the first thing he did was laugh. A real laugh, unguarded. Nothing like the careful patience of 6 months in a tank. "You're late," he said. "I had to be sure," I said. "The way I told you I would be." "And are you?" I thought about Finn, about a fever that had saved my life and a storm that hadn't been Kai's to answer for, about 6 months of smaller-than-true sentences, and a night the hum went silent and never quite came back the same. I thought about a folder of an old man's handwriting, growing smaller and more careful the longer he understood what he'd found, and about Voss's last words to me, about the mistake never being the loving. "I'm sure," I said and waded in. The water was cold, and then it wasn't, the way the ocean stops being an enemy the moment you stop bracing against it. And Kai's hand found mine below the surface with the same steadiness he'd pressed against the glass on the first night, except now there was nothing at all between us. We didn't go far that first evening. I wasn't built for the water the way he was, and he was careful with that, careful with me, in a way the file had never once predicted a creature like him capable of being. We stayed close to the shelf in the shallows, and he told me about his pod, about the wardens who'd have to be told, eventually, what he'd chosen and who he'd chosen it with. I told him about Finn, the whole of it this time, not the smaller version, and he listened the way he'd always listened. Like my voice was worth the same careful attention he'd once given every flicker of sensor data 6 months of captivity had taught him to read. I don't know what our life looks like from here, whether it's a small house somewhere on this coast where I can walk to the water every evening, or something stranger, something that requires me to learn a whole world beneath the surface, the way he once learned mine from behind reinforced glass. I know the agency hasn't forgotten either of our names, and that Kane's. Fate is a possibility I carry with me instead of a warning I've outrun. I know Voss still watches this stretch of coastline in her own quiet way, and I choose to believe, because it costs me nothing and gives me everything, that some part of her is glad she never quite managed to stop us. What I know for certain is this. I spent 6 months being the objective observer, writing down numbers instead of truths, believing the glass was what kept me safe. It was never the glass. It was never the distance. The only thing that ever protected me was the discipline of not letting myself be known. And the night I let that discipline break was the night I finally started, after years of treading water alone, to actually come up for air. He surfaces beside me most evenings now, right at the edge where the shelf drops away into blue-black depth, and every time, without fail, he waits for me to reach for him first, not because he has to, not anymore, but because some choices are worth making twice. And he has never once forgotten that the first time, I made it freely. End.